Hi, this is Dan Macon with University of California Cooperative Extension. I am the Livestock and Natural Resources Advisor for Placer, Nevada, Sutter, and Yuba counties. And today I'm going to talk about disaster preparation for commercial livestock operations. We'll start by talking a little bit about why commercial livestock, in particular grazing operations, are different when it comes to disaster planning. We'll do a high-level threat assessment looking at what we should worry about and what's at risk. And then we'll talk about developing a disaster preparation plan and the importance of writing it down and sharing it with others. When it comes to commercial livestock operations, I think there are a number of differences when it comes to disaster planning when you look at hobby operations or backyard operations. First of all, these are both homes and businesses in many cases, and I think that complicates the planning process. The scale of operation is very different. Typically with a commercial operation, you may not be able to evacuate all of your animals in a single trip. Remote locations can be problematic, just getting to where the livestock are, and many of us have livestock in multiple locations. And then I think there's a real difference in terms of leased versus owned property in the way of emergency access. And we'll talk about that in a little more detail. Excuse me. So what are the threats? Well, wildfire's certainly been a big one over these last several years throughout Northern California, and that's one we need to be concerned with. Flooding can be a problem as well, and we're seeing more intense rainfall events. Flooding could be a bigger issue in years to come. We all had experience this last fall, I think, in Northern California with public safety power shutoffs, and this can create some issues for livestock producers as well. Foreign animal disease can be a significant issue if we were to have an outbreak here of foot and mouth disease, for example. Drought can be a real problem. Obviously, we've had some recent experience with that, and you may be able to think of others that you've had experience with. The reason it's important to think about these threats is that it has some bearing on how much warning we'll have, how much response time we'll have. So in the case of wildfire, obviously, we may have minutes to maybe hours to respond, depending on how close the fire is to our operation. Very short notice. Foreign animal disease, I think for most of us would be unexpected. We can expect a shutdown if we had foot and mouth disease, a shutdown of all animal movement for 3 or 4 days, and that could be an impact to us as well. Typically with our public safety power shutoff situations this last fall, we had several days notice so we could prepare, whether it meant getting generators in place or hauling water for livestock. Flood issues, we typically will know in advance through the weather forecasting that flooding is a possibility. There may be some cases where it's much shorter notice, but typically we know something's coming. And then drought, obviously, is kind of a slow-moving, long-term emergency that we may have months or even years to address. When I think about what's at risk, I like to split it up into these 5 categories. Certainly health and safety for the people involved in your operation is critical. And I think we should also consider mental health. We certainly saw that with the drought and have seen that with wildfire, that we need to pay attention to mental health as well. Livestock health and safety is a concern. There are life and death risks, but there can also be health risks and some stress-induced production losses, so we need to consider those. Property and infrastructure are critical, not only homes, but barns and outbuildings, corrals, fences, water supplies, our equipment. And then I think it's really important in terms of infrastructure to also think about the information and data we have on our operations, whether it's animal production records or insurance information or what have you. For a grazing operation, forage is at risk, not only the standing forage, the grass that's out there in your rangelands or your pastures, but stored forage potentially. And then there's kind of these seasonal impacts where maybe it's not a short-term loss of forage, but it's grass that you were saving for fall or winter grazing that you need to concern yourself with. And then finally, this idea of access. I think owned versus leased property presents very different access issues. If we had a wildfire on a leased property, law enforcement may not let us have access to our animals because our identification doesn't show that address. There can be physical barriers, whether it's from flooding or from trees falling over the road or other types of things that block access. And then we may lose the ability to move livestock, at least in the short term, if we were dealing with a foreign animal disease. So I think, and we've done this in our own sheep operation, I think it's vitally important to make a plan that addresses these things. First and foremost, we want to address human health and safety. There is some evidence that perhaps sheltering in place may be an option. We look at what happened in some of the wildfire situations here recently. Evacuation was difficult given transportation routes. Having an emergency supply kit is important. Some drinking water, medications, health records, those types of things are important to protecting our own health and safety. And then we want to think about protecting our buildings, infrastructure, and information. And this means defensible space around all the infrastructure, including outbuildings and wells, having copies of legal documents and insurance information, and also having a backup of your production records and financial records. In terms of protecting forage, we can think about creating fuel breaks near potential ignition sources. If you think about where fires tend to start, maybe a fuel break between the pasture and the county road is appropriate in this regard. Thinking about protecting your stockpiled forage, whether it's standing forage you're saving for the fall or a barn full of hay. And then also thinking about whether you're going to be able to move livestock to where the grass is, or will you need to haul feed to the livestock. This is potentially a problem in a foreign animal disease outbreak. If all livestock movement is halted and your livestock are out of feed, how are you going to get hay to them? How long is that likely to last? Protecting livestock, we can also think about evacuation versus sheltering in place. If you've got several loads of animals that you would need to move, do you have loading facilities on site? How many trucks will you need to move all the livestock? How much time will you have? And alternatively, are there some safe zones, whether it's irrigated pasture or dry lots or things of that nature where the animals could be safe? Remove or reduce any hazards. We use a lot of temporary fence in our sheep operation. We would probably, if it was a fast-moving fire, try to let sheep out of the fence so they wouldn't get tangled in it. Think about how you're going to get water to livestock. If the power's out and you rely on an electric well to pump stock water, what are your alternatives? Are the vaccinations in your animals current? If it's possible that you may have to commingle animals with other people's livestock, having current vaccinations might be critical. And then can you get the needed medications you would need for your animals in an emergency? If you have medications that require refrigeration and the power goes out, do you have a plan for that? In terms of access, are you going to be able to get to your livestock? And we talked about leased property, but again, there may be barriers like trees over the roadway or flooded creeks that would keep you from getting to your animals as well. Think about escape routes. Where will you go and how will you get there? Do you have a backup escape route? Do you have backup help? Do you have a list of other ranchers that are nearby that could help you in case of emergency? And then this last point I think is really important as well. I think all of us in agriculture watch the weather pretty closely, and I think that's important. During the summertime, we scan the horizon for smoke and we listen for the sound of fire planes. If I hear a fire plane go over in the summer, I take a look to see how low it is and what direction it's headed relative to where our sheep are grazing. And so I think just being aware of what's going on around us is really important. So why should you write it down? I find that writing it down makes me think a little more thoroughly about the plan, but it also provides something that I can share. And I think it is important to share the plan. A plan that stays in your own head does you maybe some good, but doesn't help your family or your employees. And so I think those folks that have a direct interest in the business absolutely need to know the details of your plan. But probably we also need to share the broad outlines of the plan with our neighbors and with other ranchers, just so they're aware of what's going on, and maybe it will encourage them to do some similar planning as well. We've started to share our plan with law enforcement, with fire officials, and with animal control as well. Partly so they know we're thinking about it, but partly so we can start building those relationships that would hopefully give us access during an emergency. And then lastly, I think it's probably also important for your veterinarian to know you've got a plan and maybe to comment in particular on some of the animal health aspects of the plan. It's a good opportunity to get some outside advice. We've developed this little framework for helping people put together a plan. This is for fire in particular, but we write down information about the livestock, inventory numbers, types of animals, physical location, and hopefully including the time we turn out on that property and then when we're going to move out. We give some real thought to safe zones or shelter in place options. We've got some horse paddocks that are pretty devoid of vegetation near where the sheep are in the summertime, and that could be a possible shelter in place option. We write down evacuation and access routes so that anybody that we send this to kind of knows where the animals are and how they can get them out. And then we also make some notes about some other critical issues, whether we have guard animals with the livestock, where the stock water resources are, etc. And lastly, we have overall emergency contacts, which are typically family members, and then we put location contacts so that everybody knows if there's a fire, for example, at Blue Oak Ranch, who we would call. For further reading, here's a couple of resources for you. I've done a more detailed publication on wildfire preparation that includes a fillable template like you saw on the last slide. That's available on my website. CAL FIRE has a great website that's got some really good information on what you should keep in your emergency supply kit, and I would certainly suggest taking a look at that. And then there is within Extension nationally a disaster education network, and their website has a variety of resources that I think you'll find helpful in thinking about preparing and planning for disasters. With that, I hope you have a good rest of your day.